Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to VSPG. Today we have a presentation by Dr. Emmy Smith from Johns Hopkins University. And we'll be hearing about the Ediacaran Cambrian transition in the southern Great Basin, United States. Andre, could you please go ahead and introduce Emmy for us?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce Emmy Smith. Emmy did her bachelor in Amherst College, I guess, working with Woody Hagedorn, but probably introduced her to Cambrian or late Ediacaran. She then took a couple of years to teach and travel, and she was teaching with USGS in US and in China and Indonesia. And when she enrolled at Harvard doing PhD with Francis MacDonald, which was based on work in Mongolia on, I guess, late Neoproterozoic and Cambrian transition. She followed with postdoc at Smithsonian National Museum, working with Doug Irwin, I presume. And when she ended up as an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, where her group continued work on Neoproterozoic early Cambrian transition, the topic which will talk to us today. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and I pass it to you.
Great. Well, thanks for that kind and thorough introduction, Andre, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you both for continuing to organize this great seminar series. It's really been fantastic, and thanks to everyone who's here. So yeah, as Andre said, today I'm going to be talking about the Ediacaran Cambrian transition in the southern Great Basin and some of the work that I've been doing, my group members have been doing, and collaborators have been doing for about the past decade out in Nevada and in California. And these are, here I'm showing some of the fossils that we found in this region. There we go. So before diving in, I just want to do acknowledgements. This work wouldn't have been possible without a lot of other people. I had a lot of help and a lot of terrific collaborators and students working on this project with me. So I'm listing some of them here, showing some of their faces. Yeah, it was a lot of fun working with all these folks. I'd also like to thank funding agencies. So there was funding from NSF, from the Sloan Foundation, APS, Johns Hopkins, and the Smithsonian that helped fund some of this work. And then finally, I'd like to thank the different agencies that granted me permits to do this work. So the BLM, Death Valley National Park, and the Inyo National Forest all granted me permits to do this work. All right, so today, obviously, I'll be talking about the Ediacaran Cambrian. This is right at the very end of the Precambrian. So during this time, Earth's surface transitions from a relatively unrecognizable biotic world during the Ediacaran into the Cambrian world, in which most of these enigmatic fossils disappear. And within about 20 to 30 million years, there's evidence of about 90% of modern animal phyla appearing in the fossil record. So this is arguably the most important geobiological revolution of the past billion years. It's characterized by large perturbations to global geochemical cycles, a permanent step change in the nature of the sedimentary record, the rise of macroscopic eukaryotic life, and potentially one or more pulses of extinction, potentially mass extinction. And so just to zoom in on this boundary in a bit more detail. And so here is the Ediacaran, oh, losing my pointer. Here's the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary located, apologies, I don't know what's going on with the pointer. Anyway, it's located right here. I think there might be a hair on my mouse. Okay, so yeah, this is a figure from a recent review paper that was led by Simon Derrick, and this illustrates the stratigraphic distribution and diversity among groups of the Ediacara biota, and that's this blue box shown on the left-hand side of the screen, as well as metazoans, metazoan biota, bilaterian ichnogenera, shown here, and a delta C13 carbonate carbon isotope curve, shown on the right-hand side of the screen. extinction intensities as shown as a percentage of general lost, that's shown right here. And this is given for the two putative extinction pulses that have been proposed. The first at the White Sea Nama assemblage right here, where this lower star is, and the second at the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary right here. So this is another figure from that same review paper that shows, based off of this model, it shows a hypothetical model for proposed extinction during the Ediacaran Cambrian transition. So this model shows the majority of the Ediacara biota, which is this light blue color, as stem group metazoans. And with the first pulse of extinction again at the White Sea Nama transition, which is at the base of this tan or peach colored box. And this transition is driven by the diversification of crown group metazoan clades, which is that's the darker blue color that's shown here. And this second pulse of extinction follows at the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. And in this model, this is shown as an extinction that's driven by an environmental perturbation. So this is what's been referred to as a catastrophe extinction. So this is a screenshot of this review paper that I've mentioned by Simon Derrick that came out a few months ago. So in it, it reviews progress that's been made on the Ediacaran Cambrian transition during the last 5 years and discusses some of the big outstanding questions about the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary remaining. And the hope is that these questions will help focus and set the research agenda for the next decade. And so some of these research questions that are listed and proposed in this review paper and some of the questions that motivate my own research agenda is, do these apparent intervals of biotic turnover at the end of the Ediacaran represent mass extinction intervals? Are Ediacaran Cambrian carbon isotope excursions recording global environmental perturbations? And what role did the end Ediacaran extinction play in the Cambrian explosion? So my group has been working on trying to answer these questions in a number of places globally. And one of the areas that we've been focusing on is in the southern Great Basin. And so here I'm showing a photo from the field of one of these sites. And this was taken back in 2014. So nearly a decade ago when I first started working in this area. And this is one of the first places where I discovered and my group discovered some of these Ediacaran, really exquisitely preserved Ediacaran fossils. Okay, so why study the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary in the Great Basin? It's not one of the famous Ediacaran localities like Australia or South China or Namibia. So why go to the Ediacaran? Why go to the Great Basin to study this transition? So one reason is that it's one of the first regions where the first occurrence of the trace fossil Trectichnus pedum, which is how the base of the Cambrian is formally defined. It's one of the first places where this trace fossil was stratigraphically linked to a large negative delta C13 excursion. And this work was done in the late 90s and early 2000s. This excursion, which is now, it's referred to as the BACE, B-A-C-E, it's now considered a secondary stratigraphic marker that's used to identify the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary in many localities globally. There are rare Ediacaran fossils in this region, as I've shown in my first slide, and as I'll continue to show in this talk. These units have been interpreted as recording the final stages of rifting in southwestern Laurentia before the establishment of the Paleozoic passive margin. So together, these strata offer an important archive for understanding potential links among biotic change, environmental perturbation, and tectonism across this important geobiological transition. So this is a figure showing a paleogeographic reconstruction around the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. So we're on the paleocontinent of Laurentia, and the southern Great Basin is located on the northwest corner of Laurentia, where the yellow star is. So zooming in a bit more to the study area, this is a map of Nevada and California. The area is really accessible for North American geologists because it's located so close to Las Vegas and LA. Guessing that many of you here today have seen some of these rocks, even if it was just on an undergraduate field trip. So a lot of people are familiar with these units and these strata. This area has been deformed by Mesozoic contractional events and subsequent Cenozoic extensional and strike slip faulting. And so some of these faults are shown in this map here. The green units on the map are Ediacaran Cambrian units of interest. So the lighter green units that you see, these are in the Death Valley region, the Ediacaran Cambrian units in the Death Valley region. And these darker units are the Ediacaran Cambrian units in the White Inyo region and the Esmeralda County region. You'll see some ovals on the map, some orange ovals and some yellow ovals, and these are marking the locations of measured sections that I'll show in a few slides. And just to continue orienting you, so I'm boxing the Death Valley region, and this is the most proximal region to paleo shoreline. So these are the shallowest sections that I'm going to be showing. The White Inyo ranges are located more offshore. These are still pretty shallow, so these are outer shelf deposits. And then the most distal sections that I'm going to be showing are located in Esmeralda County, Nevada. And so the deepening direction at the time of deposition was to the west-northwest. I'll note that this Esmeralda County region in paleospastic reconstructions would restore further to the north and further to the west. So there's been a ton of study. It's too much for me to review in this talk. A ton of study on Ediacaran Cambrian strata in the Great Basin. So formal geologic studies on Neoproterozoic and Cambrian strata began in the late 19th century. These studies, stratigraphic studies, were pushed forward by USGS scientists and PhD students in the early 20th century. They actually named many of the units at this point, and many of those names still stand. Wheeler of the Wheeler diagram first proposed the stratigraphic correlations of Neoproterozoic and Cambrian units across the Great Basin. And so he first proposed some of the correlations between the Death Valley region and the White Inyo region. And then many, many others since then, but most notably Jack Stewart, or Jack Stewart, who worked at the USGS, built upon this early regional framework to create a really robust and detailed stratigraphic framework for the Neoproterozoic Cambrian strata in this region. So here I'm showing generalized stratigraphy and proposed correlations and biostratigraphy for these units in the Death Valley region and the White Inyo and Esmeralda County region. So this section on the right is from Southeast Death Valley. Again, this is the most proximal section going off into the White Inyos. So just to start familiarizing you with some of the names, the units that I'm going to be focusing on are the Wood Canyon Formation in the Death Valley region and the Deep Spring Formation in these outer shelf deposits further to the north and west. The red stars mark where soft-bodied Ediacaran fossils have been discovered. And so you'll see they've been discovered in these most proximal sections in Death Valley, in northern Death Valley, and also in the White Inyos and in Esmeralda County. And yeah, now I'm just boxing the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary, showing where it's been placed based off of the first appearance of the trace fossil Tryptichnus pedum. And here are some photos from the field, just giving you a sense for what outcrop looks like. These rocks are incredibly well exposed and extensive laterally. So figure A this is of a section in northern Death Valley near Echo Canyon. If you're familiar with the region, you can see this upper sterling quartzite, this white to pink, typically a coarse sandstone to pebble conglomerate. And on top of that is the lower member of the Wood Canyon, which is where the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary is found. This is predominantly fine-grained siliciclastics, and there are these 3 dolomite marker beds in the more northern sections of Death Valley. Figure B is showing the lower part of the Deep Spring Formation in Esmeralda County. So this is latest Ediacaran stratigraphy. And on top of this is the middle member of the Deep Spring Formation, or the Esmeralda member of the Deep Spring Formation. the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary so here I'm just showing where the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary has been placed in both the Death Valley region and in Esmeralda County, based off of TPDM. And here I'm also showing a couple of these localities or specific stratigraphic intervals where Ediacaran body fossils have been discovered. Okay, so there were fossils that had been previously reported from the southern Great Basin, and here I'm showing some of these reports from the early 2000s. You can see these circular disc-shaped fossils that were reported from the Wood Canyon. Some cast-in molds of tubular body fossils, and some of these were called cloudinids. This is a possible Swartpuntia fossil. Here's a possible, this was reported as a possible Ernietomorph, and then other tubular body fossils and trace fossils. So yeah, there were Ediacaran body fossils known from this region, but not many, and most of them were from the Death Valley region. So we first discovered some of these better preserved fossils in Esmeralda County. And here I'm showing some of these fossils. Some of these were first reported in this 2016 paper, and then some from the Death Valley region were reported in this 2017 paper. And so what you see here is a variety of tubular body fossils and morphologies discovered in a few different localities across the basin. There's also this slab with Ernietomorphs. So these are members of the Ediacara biota. So this is a photo of the slab and an annotated image of this slab. And another thing I want to point out is that here I'm showing a diversity of taphonomic modes. So there's 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional pyritization. So here you can see this lightly pyritized tubular fossil. And here's another example of this 2-dimensional pyritization. 3-dimensional pyritization, such as this fossil right here and this one over here in C. Different types of cast and mold preservation. So there's cast and mold preservation of some of these annulated tubular fossils, as well as the Ernietomorphs in this slab. Calcification. So there are calcified tubular fossils that have been called cloudinids. And then there are reflective compressions, such as this fossil shown in C right here. So yeah, a real variety of taphonomic modes, which allows us to explore spatially the relationship between paleoenvironmental setting and different pathways to fossil preservation. I just want to briefly mention that there has been subsequent work done on many of these fossils, and there continue to be additional fossil finds from this region. I don't have time to get into all of these, but I want to briefly mention a couple studies that I think are pretty cool. One is this study that was led by Jim Schiffbauer at Mizzou and some of his colleagues there. And in this study, they took some of these pyritized tubular fossils, such as this one right here, and they did a micro CT scan of these fossils to create 3-dimensional reconstructions that revealed these internal tubular structures that are shown in orange in this figure. And these structures are interpreted as soft tissue features and possible digestive tracts within these tubular organisms. And this is important and just, I think, so fascinating because it provides evidence to support the idea that Claudina were bilaterians. And so Claudinamorphs have remained really problematic phylogenetically for decades. And this provides some data to support the idea that these were early bilaterians. Another really cool study, I think, is one that's being done by Scott Evans. So this is work that's in preparation. And what he did is he took this slab with Ernietomorphs in it and created a 3D scan of this. And that's shown right here. And what this allowed him to do is visualize some of these fossils so that you can see there's several fossils within this single slab. And he discovered additional diversity within this slab and can start to spatially visualize how these different structures, different fossils relate to one another. Okay, so what can we say? I just want to summarize a few points about the Great Basin fossil assemblage. The first is that the Ediacara biota and tubular body fossils from this region are really similar to other late Ediacaran Nama fossil assemblages. So we see a variety of tubular fossils, different morphologies of these tubular fossils, cloudinomorphs, and Ediacara, some of the Ediacara biota known as ernietomorphs. And the second point I want to make is that even with the recognition of new taxa, all the new discoveries that have been made from this region, the Southern Great Basin assemblage remains a relatively low diversity assemblage. And so this is another figure from a figure created by Scott Evans that shows the Great Basin fossil assemblage relative to some of these other more famous Ediacaran fossil assemblages, such as Australia, the White Sea, Namibia, Mistaken Point. And I just want to point out that this is a log scale. So this is log diversity and log abundance. Okay, one other point I want to make before I get into this basin-wide framework is about microbial structures from the Ediacaran Cambrian and the Great Basin. So it's long been recognized that microbial structures, such as these wrinkle structures shown here, are really common at the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. So you can see this quote from this paper from Hagedorn and Botcher. Many of these wrinkle structures are, all of these wrinkle structures are from the Great Basin. And here they write, wrinkle structures are a class of oddly textured sedimentary structures that are common in Proterozoic Cambrian marine siliciclastic strata, but uncommon in post-Ordovician subtidal marine facies. So yeah, a bunch of previous workers have recognized that at the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary, there are a variety of microbially induced sedimentary structures. And so we found many of these structures. You can see in figure B, here's another example of this microbial induced sedimentary structure from the Wood Canyon Formation. But in addition to this, we found other microbial textures, microbialites and ooids in these Ediacaran Cambrian boundary units from the Great Basin. So this is a thrombolite from the Deep Spring Formation. They're actually stromatolites in some of the dolomite marker beds of the lower Wood Canyon, which previously had not been recognized. They're pysoids and ooids from the lower Wood Canyon. These are preserved as ghosts because the rocks, ooid ghosts, because the rocks are so recrystallized. And then there are these really strange and unusual annulated tubular structures that we interpreted as microbial mat-bound ripples within the Deep Spring Formation. And then also stromatolites in the Deep Spring Formation. So a variety of different microbial stromatolitic structures, ooids within these units. Okay, so now just to return to this map, now that we have all these fossils, and unusual sedimentary structures, this motivated this more regional study. And so we want to be able to place these finds within a basin-wide and sequence stratigraphic context. So in the next slide, I'm going to show a really busy slide, and I'm going to show 14 measured sections from across the basin. Okay, so I apologize, there's a ton of information here, and I'm going to try to break it down. So yeah, as I mentioned, there are 14 measured sections. The top half and the bottom half of this figure show the same measured sections and their interpreted correlation tie lines. The top shows chemostratigraphic carbon isotope data, while the bottom shows paleontological data. One thing I want to point out is the scale. So this is 100 meters. So this section on the far left is about 300 to 350 meters. The brown colored boxes in the measured sections, those are different siliciclastic facies. The light blue, these are dolostone beds. And the darker blue are limestone beds, different limestone facies. The units of study here are primarily the lower Wood Canyon Formation. So you can see that here for the Death Valley region. And then the Deep Spring Formation. And so you can see the different members listed on the far left-hand side of the screen for the outer shelf sections. And then finally on the far left, I'm showing where the placement of the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary is within this framework. Okay, so in the next slide, I'm going to zoom in just on the bottom half of this figure. All right, so here, this is a figure basically showing the paleontological and taphonomic data. And so what we have are Ediacaran fossils that are found in 7 different stratigraphic sections and in 5 different taphonomic modes. And those 5 taphonomic modes are indicated by the different colors of the stars. So the different taphonomic windows of the Ediacaran body fossil preservation and their lateral extent across this region allows for placement of these fossils into a paleogeographic and sequence stratigraphic context that spans thousands of square kilometers within this fluvial deltaic to shallow marine continental margin setting. And so this is important because this framework can be used to better understand the environmental setting of these ecological communities, as well as the processes and depositional settings that contributed to the preservation of the fossils found in this region. So what I'm going to do now is just step through some of the results and some of the implications for these fossils. Okay, so I mentioned calcified tubular fossils. Calcified tubular fossils are found in 5 localities here. These are cloudinamorphs. None of these fossils were preserved in situ in reefs. So some cloudinids have been reported in situ in reefs from Namibia. So instead, these fossils are found in lag deposits. That's what's shown in these photographs here. And so these occurrences support the model that cloudinamorph aggregates are detrital buildups, has been suggested by Akshay Mehra and Malouf in their 2018 paper. This Ernietamorph slab comes from the Death Valley region from this section right here. So there's 3D endorelief preservation of Ernietamorphs. It's only present in the lower Wood Canyon Formation, but these fossils, they're extremely rare in this region. And there's only 1 locality with undisputed Ernietamorphs. We walked a ton of rock and looked really hard for more of these, and they're just incredibly hard to find. It's been suggested that one reason they might be so rare is that their preservation requires a few different things, including rapid burial, minimal transport, and texturally mature and compositionally immature siliciclastic sediment. So that's some work that's been done by James Hall. Okay, so cast and mold preservation of tubular organisms. This occurs in a few different sections across the basin, so both in the Death Valley region and the White-Inyo region. You can see these beautiful beautiful cast and mold preservation of these Gaudiaceae shown over here. These occurrences occur in expanded transgressions within the intertidal zone. They often occur on bedding surfaces with mud chips, and so they're interpreted as transported. These fossils often occur in the same intervals as 2-dimensional reflective compressions, and also with lightly 2-dimensionally preserved pyrotized fossils. So it's interesting that there are a few different taphonomic modes found together in some of these intervals. And globally, cast and mold preservation of Ediacara biota is really common, and there have been a number of different taphonomic pathways suggested to explain the reason for this. And based off of the data that we see here, and these specific fossils in the Great Basin, we suggest that the preservation of these fossils was facilitated through the precipitation of early authigenic clays via clay microbe interactions and rapid burial. And so this pathway has been explored experimentally by a number of authors, including the ones listed here. Okay, pyrotized tubular fossils. These are found in a few different sections, both in the Death Valley region and in Esmeralda County. These are found in mudstone, siltstone, and fine micaceous sandstone. These are interpreted to have been deposited in shallow paleo environments based off of sedimentary structures. So stromatolite beds are found below and above these in some sections. In correlative sections, there are mud cracks and interference ripples found in some of the same strata that have these guys. So we suggest that the geochemical conditions necessary for preservation could have been achieved through partial restriction in a lagoonal paleo environment. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and switch to talk about the chemostratigraphic data, so the other half of that figure. So now we're considering the chemostratigraphic data. So this shows carbon isotope data plotted next to the measured sections. At the base of the section, you see positive delta C13 values of up to +4 per mil. So you can see that, for example, in this section right here. In all of the sections, there's a large negative carbon isotope excursion with values that are as low as -8 per mil. So you can see the nadir located here. So this is not the first time this excursion has been recognized in this section, but what's new about what I'm presenting here is the resolution at which this excursion is documented and the reproducibility shown across the basin. So we're showing reproducibility of this excursion, which has been termed the BACE, and some of the smaller scale features, smaller scale perturbations that can be seen in some of these sections. So this excursion is reproducible despite changes in carbonate content of sections, despite variable dolomitization, and despite sedimentary facies change. So you can see this particularly well in the Dunphy member of the Dunphy member of the Deep Spring Formation. So in some of these sections over here, you can see the variable dolomitization at this scale. And also in these units down here, there are different facies, carbonate facies preserved, and different carbonate content preserved. And so here, another point I want to make is the BACE spans a number of regionally significant sequence boundaries. So you can see some of these sequence boundaries shown on the far left-hand side of the screen. So considering the BACE in the Great Basin, there have been a number of studies on other shallow water carbonate platforms globally that have demonstrated that delta C13 values of carbonate strata can be records of changes in local mineralogy and or early diagenesis rather than records of secular change in the isotopic composition of global seawater. And so I think our community as a whole is trying to reckon with how do we interpret these carbon isotope chemostratigraphic data. Even if certain carbon isotope excursions are regionally and globally reproducible, it's been demonstrated that these secular shifts in delta C13 values can be the result of sea level driven diagenesis. So reproducibility on a regional scale doesn't necessarily mean that this is global. And then in addition, other studies have shown that significant carbon isotopic shifts can correlate with dolomitization fronts, which is why I mentioned this feature about the variable dolomitization across this basin. So what can we say based off of the data that we've presented? The results here demonstrate that the drivers of the BACE must have at least been regionally extensive, if not global. And I have a student, Mary Lonsdale, who is doing more detailed work on the diagenetic history of these rocks, trying to further interrogate this question of whether or not the BACE was primary or secondary, global or local. And then finally, if we consider the biostratigraphic data alongside the chemostratigraphic data, we can show that all of the fossil occurrences, all of these latest Ediacaran body fossil occurrences occur below the nadir of this carbon isotope excursion. So they're all found below the BACE, and the Cambrian trace fossils are all found above it. So at least in this region, there does seem to be biotic turnover that coincides with environmental perturbation. Okay, I want to shift gears slightly and now consider the juxtaposed outer shelf iniostrata against the inner shelf Death Valley strata. And that juxtaposition occurs right here where I'm circling. So these areas have obviously a different stratigraphic nomenclature, and that's because there's a marked difference in the units between these two regions. And so if we consider where this occurs on the map, it's the location of the last chance range, which I've circled in blue here. And this is where the last chance thrust fault occurs. This fault was thought to have been active between the late early Permian and the middle early Triassic, and all of the Inyo-facies strata are thought to overlie this thrust fault with an estimated shortening of about 30 kilometers. And so if we now consider the schematic transect of this basin that's based off of the measured stratigraphic sections that I showed earlier in this PowerPoint, this shows the proposed correlations between the Death Valley region and the wide Inyo ranges within a tectonic framework. So in the Death Valley region, Deposition of Tony and Cryogenian strata has been suggested by some to have occurred within semi-restricted tectonically active fault-bound basins. That's what's shown right here. And these units, these Tonian and Cryogenian units, as well as the Mesoproterozoic basement, do not outcrop up in the White and Yeo regions. The Ediacaran Cambrian units, on the other hand, it's shown above right here, were deposited during more regionally consistent subsidence, indicative of rifting followed by lithospheric thermal contraction. And so also during the Ediacaran Cambrian, rift-related faulting established the northwest dipping margin, but it's not necessarily clear where this was. And we suggest that one possible location for this rift shoulder, this Ediacaran rift shoulder, could be at the break between the Death Valley and the White and Yeo facies belts. And so that is what's shown basically in the middle of this figure here. So if this is correct, the shale basin of the Wyman Formation down here was deposited on the hanging wall of a northwest dipping fault that formed the shelf edge of the incipient passive continental margin. And if this is correct, then the Permian last chance thrust fault reactivated this late Ediacaran normal fault and transported the White and Yeo facies belt Creightonward toward Death Valley. And so the initiation of sedimentation in the White and Yeo ranges would have coincided with active rift tectonism during the mid to late Ediacaran, or during Johnny time. So we don't have any subsurface data. This obviously is speculative, but it offers an explanation for the juxtaposition of these two regions and some of the observations that have been made about some of the older units underlying the Ediacaran Cambrian strata. So I'm mentioning rift-related faulting at the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. What about rift-related volcanism? Is there any evidence for this? So there's not abundant evidence for rift-related volcanism in Southwest Laurentia, but there is some evidence. So here I'm showing a transect that's oriented roughly perpendicular to the one I previously showed. So here it's northwest to southeast. You can see where these sections are located in Nevada in this inset map here. So in 3 of these sections in Nevada, there are Ediacaran Cambrian basalt units. So here's one shown in green in Caliente, another one in Delamar, and then there are thin basalts in the Spring Mountains. So it's hard to see at the scale, but here I'm marking where this basalt unit occurs. So now if we consider evidence for mafic volcanism more regionally, so we're taking a step back here and thinking about what's happening in Southwest Laurentia, there are synrift volcanics and volcaniclastics in northern Mexico, further north in Nevada, and also in Utah. So here I'm showing sections 2 and 3 are Delamar and Caliente that I previously showed. You can see this section number 1 down in northern Mexico, Sonora, Mexico. There's a section in Patterson Mountain further north in Nevada, and then these sections in Utah as well. And all of these have basalts in them. And aside from the Mexico section, the ages of these volcanic rocks and the units hosting them are not well constrained, but they're generally considered to be late Ediacaran to early Cambrian in age, based off of some of the trace fossils that have been discovered, and also based off of regional correlations. And given the regional stratigraphic correlations, many of these basalt intervals in the Southwest US are likely correlative with the basalts in Mexico, which have been dated to about 539 MA. And they've also been genetically related to rift-related crustal thinning and faulting along the western and/or southern margins of Laurentia. So the plumbing systems for these volcanic units have not been identified, but Ediacaran Cambrian normal faults are plausible magmatic conduits. Okay, so now stepping back even further and considering what's happening more widely on Laurentia, these mafic volcanics are at least partially correlative to bimodal rift-related magmatism of the Wichita province in southwestern Oklahoma. That's shown right here in this green shape right here. And this is constrained to 539.5 to 530 MA. So the Wichita is thought to be part of a more than a 250,000 cubic kilometer large igneous province associated with the rifting of the southern margin of Laurentia. And so here, what this figure is showing is North America, obviously in brown, and then the blue line shows the rifted margins of Laurentia. And we can consider different segments of these rifted margins. And some of these remain surprisingly poorly, the timing of rifting for some of these remains surprisingly poorly constrained. The darker shading or the darker colored units in the stars show where there is evidence for Ediacaran aged volcanism. And then the lighter shading that shows interpreted ages of rifting along individual parts of the margin, where it eventually resulted in a passive margin. Okay, and so I want to end with maybe something that's a little bit controversial and speculative, but one of the things that we see in the Great Basin is this coincidence among a large negative carbon isotope excursion, microbial abundant and somewhat unusual microbial and sedimentological features, biotic turnover, and mafic volcanism, all in Southwest Laurentia. And so a coincidence of geochemical perturbations, lips, unusual sedimentary features, and biotic turnover have been documented for many Phanerozoic geologic boundaries. And it's been at the root of much speculation and debate over the causes and effects of coeval environmental change and mass extinction. So this temporal coincidence of all these features that appears at the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary has led us to put forth the hypothesis that the end Ediacaran extinction could be mechanistically linked to the rift-related large igneous province along the southwestern margin of Laurentia, and that this is potentially analogous to some other Phanerozoic boundaries, such as the Permian-Triassic and/or the Triassic-Jurassic. So we're not the first to suggest this idea, but here we're providing additional evidence from the Southern Great Basin that I think supports this model. And again, I'll note that this relationship is speculative and tenuous and needs to continue to be tested. But that being said, at several other Phanerozoic geologic boundaries, demonstrating the age correlation between extinction events and large igneous provinces has provided some of the initial compelling evidence for mechanistic links, even when the specific environmental and climatic changes and kill mechanisms resulting from individual lips remain controversial. So yeah, I think this is something that the community should continue to think about and consider and test. Okay, so the conclusions so far, we place Ediacaran fossils in a sequence stratigraphic and basin-wide framework to understand the setting of latest Ediacaran ecological communities and the processes and depositional settings that contributed to fossil preservation. The BACE, this negative carbon isotope excursion, is a regionally reproduced excursion that spans sequence boundaries with variable sedimentary facies and variable dolomitization, consistent with regional, if not a global perturbation to the carbon cycle. We suggest that the facies break between the Death Valley and White Inyo regions resulted from a major late Ediacaran rift shoulder, with the Ediacaran-Wyman Formation shale basin being deposited on the basinward hanging wall. And that the early Permian last chance thrust fault may have reactivated this Ediacaran normal fault. And then finally, the coincidence of the BACE, the biotic turnover, and unusual sedimentological features coincides with the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. Rift-related basalts in the Wichita Lip also coincide temporally with this boundary, and we suggest that the emplacement of volcanic magmas within newly formed organic-rich rift basins could have resulted in some of the cascading environmental and ecological changes at the Ediacaran Cambrian, and that this is perhaps analogous in some ways to the Permian-Triassic and/or Triassic-Jurassic. Okay, so what I'm going to do with the remaining time is present the results of a related project and present some new uranium-lead ages from the Lower Wood Canyon Formation. And these are important because they place
Okay. Did we all lose Emmy, or was it just me, or maybe you all lost me?
I can hear you, Alex, but Emmy seems to be frozen.
Okay.
You're good to me, Alex, but I've lost Emmy too.
So nobody is hearing me?
No.
No,
Oh, we
Oh, no, I hear you, Alex,
Oh, okay. Okay, great.
but I don't
All right.
hear Emmy. Emmy's frozen.
All right, thank you. I'll send her an email. Okay. Thanks for the info in. Okay, looks like Emmy just hopped off and is back on. Great. You're still muted there, Emmy. I sent you a request to unmute.
Sorry about that, everyone. I guess there was a internet disruption at Hopkins. I don't know what happened. Where did
It was the very last slide where you were going to just talk a bit about the continued work. We missed it all.
Did you see this slide?
We saw this slide. All of this slide, and then as soon as you switched here, yep. So you could just start this from the start. Yeah.
So sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, so what I'm going to present are new uranium-lead ages from the Lower Wood Canyon Formation, and these are important because they place constraints on the base of the Cambrian. So this work was led by Lyle Nelson. It was done in collaboration with Boise State, and it was funded through the NSF, the really terrific NSF Ages 2 program. This was published a few months ago in PNAS, and I put this photo up because it's just a really fun place to work. The Ediacaran Cambrian boundary is in the background of this figure, and one of the reasons this site is so fun to work at is because they're wild horses, which are shown in this this image right here. So the data that I'm going to be showing, they come from the Spring Mountains, just outside of Pahrump, Nevada, and just west of Las Vegas. And these are ages from the lower member of the Wood Canyon Formation. All right, so here are some sections. I've shown different versions of these sections previously in my talk. So these are sections going from the Death Valley region to the outer shelf sections of the White Inyos. You can see the, lost my pointer. And okay, there we go. You can see again this large negative carbon isotope excursion. The section where the ages come from is this section boxed in blue here in the Spring Mountains. It's very similar to the Montgomery Mountain section, which is located nearby. And the reason why this is important is that the Montgomery Mountains this is the locality where many of the well-preserved Ediacaran fossils and Cambrian trace fossils have come from. So you can see some of these fossils shown here. There's a similar assemblage that's found in the Spring Mountains. So you can see kind of this poorly preserved but convincing pyritized annulated cloudinomorph, this possible Ernietta right here, and then Tryptichnus pedum and other bilaterian trace fossils higher up in this section. So similar assemblage, and we can correlate these assemblages and correlate the sections. Okay, there were three horizons that were dated that are shown by these yellow circles. Here's a photograph of this lowest horizon. And at Boise State University, there was tandem laser ICP-MS and ID TIMS analysis that was done on these three samples. You can see the laser ICP-MS data shown at the bottom part of this figure. And these are the ages that I'm going to be showing. These are maximum depositional ages. And so these are detrital zircons. You can see there's a significant population of older grains, but also a significant population of these younger grains in each of the three samples. And so grains from these younger populations were taken and analyzed via ID TIMS. And the three ages are shown here. So the oldest is 532.8, and then we have ages of 531.8 and 531.3. And so if we now consider these ages within a composite chemostratigraphic curve for Laurentia, so here we're showing the carbon isotope data and showing where Tryptichnus pedum is placed within this chemostratigraphic framework for the Southern Great Basin. So this is based off of the chemostratigraphic data that I showed previously and was shown just a couple slides ago. We can place these ages. So this oldest age right here of 532.83 plus or minus 0.98 MA is really the critical one because it occurs below the first occurrence of Tryptichnus pedum. So again, this is a maximum depositional age on the first occurrence of Tryptichnus pedum. And so if we now consider age constraints globally on the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary, So this is a figure showing age constraints before these new ages from Southwest Laurentia were published. So you can see these ages that are shown in the black shapes. The best age constraints on the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary prior to this came from the Kalahari Craton in Namibia. So the best age constraints were around 538 MA, and T. pedum occurred above these dated ash horizons. Okay. But surprisingly, the FAD of T. pedum was really poorly constrained, so poorly constrained within a few million years of this critical interval right across the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary. And you can see that there are no age constraints within this gray shaded area. Okay, so here now I'm adding in the new data from Southwest Laurentia. So you can see these 3 new ages, maximum depositional ages, and then this triangle, this orange triangle represents the first occurrence of Triptichnus pedum. And why this is important is because it shows that the Ediacaran Cambrian boundary is 6 to 7 million years younger than previously thought. So it places ages on when these are now the best ages on the first occurrence of T. pedum. And so now if we consider the calibration of the early Cambrian carbon isotope record, as well as the paleontological record, here is chemostratigraphic data from Southwest Laurentia. Here are the new age constraints from this study. And then we can place this chemostratigraphic data from Morocco on top of this for the earliest Cambrian. And this has been used to calibrate the fossil record, which is shown here. This is the small shelly fossil record. And what this does is that this interval that was previously dated from 541 to 526 MA is now condensed to 533 to 526 MA. So this is a more than a 50% reduction in the earliest Cambrian. So the rates of the early Cambrian radiation are condensed significantly from previous estimates. So the conclusions from this last little bit here, the new uranium-lead age constraints from the Lower Wood Canyon Formation significantly shift the base of the Cambrian globally, suggesting a condensed early Cambrian radiation of modern animal phyla. And yeah, I think more work remains to test this age model on other paleocontinents and on other sections globally. But yeah, this is a pretty radical and exciting recalibration of the base of the Cambrian. So thanks very much for attending, for your attention. I apologize for the brief interruption, and yeah, I'll take any questions if there are any questions.
Great, thank you, Emmy. We'll go ahead and transition to question and discussion. So 2 quick things about that. If you'd like to ask your question by raising your hand, find the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can click that and you see raise hand right there. Other thing is, if you'd like to ask a question by by typing it out, you can do that in the chat, but please go ahead and do that directed towards everyone, not just me, so that both myself and the speaker can read the message. Okay, the first one was from Francis McDonald earlier. Why is the volcanism on the western margin necessarily rift related and not just the large igneous province?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about this, but the quarry wall and sorry, I'm just blanking on people's names today. So there's been geochemical work done on the basalt units from the Mexico section, and those have been demonstrated based off of the geochemical data, have been demonstrated to be rift related. And by correlation, we're suggesting there hasn't been detailed geochemical work that I know of done on any of the basalts in Nevada or in Utah. But based off of correlation to the Mexico section, we're suggesting that those are also rift related.
But Mexico's on the southern margin. Why isn't it just the rift of the southern margin instead of the rift of the western margin?
I think that's possible, but I also think it's possible that some of these sections in Nevada are being influenced by the southern margin.
Yeah, but it's important to differentiate between whether the western margin is actually rifting at that time and whether it's rift-related margin from crustal extension on the western margin instead of the southern margin. And so that's just the, why it might be interesting to do the geochemistry on those, and then just, what's the implications for the rifting on the western margin in general.
Sure.
And
Okay. Yeah.
and I guess, is there any sedimentological evidence for a rift shoulder there? Do you see any, conglomerates or anything coming off into the lower units in the Wyman where that would suggest that there's actually an active rift during the Ediacaran?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I haven't seen any immature conglomerates in the Wyman. But again, as I mentioned, the shortening, the estimated shortening is 30 kilometers. So it's possible that that's just obscured and lost within that thrust fault.
But also possible that it's just facies change, so it's over that
Sure.
distance and there's no fault needed.
Yep, I think without the subsurface data, it is very speculative, but we're putting forth the idea and I'd love pushback on it.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea and it was a really clear, excellent talk. Thanks, Emmy.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, another in the chat from Nicholas Christie Blick. Is it possible that the first appearance of T. pedum is diachronous?
Definitely. It's facies dependent. And yeah, I think it definitely could have been diachronous. But still, it's, we're left with the record that we have. And I think one of the points that, Lyle tries to make in his paper is that actually we were surprised when we compiled the ages on the first occurrence of T. pedum globally. And there were pretty poor constraints on T. pedum within this critical 5, 6, 7 million year time window. But yeah, I think it could be diachronous.
All right, next up with a hand, Rachel Surprenant, please unmute yourself.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Emmy, for a great talk. Really thorough. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, so you mentioned that pretty briefly that you observed kind of unusual microbial structures in the Great Basin. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on kind of what those are, as well as if you see kind of like any variability from the outer shelf to the inner shelf across the Great Basin in terms of like signatures of microbial mats.
Yeah, so maybe this point wasn't that clear, but there are some of the unusual microbial structures are, I showed one figure of them, but those mat-bound kind of the annulated tubular structures that are found on rippled surfaces in some cases. So some of those actually look like, we first thought they were Ediacaran fossils when we found them, but we later interpreted them as microbially induced sedimentary structures. So we published that in a geology paper, but those are some of the unusual microbial structures that I was referring to, and I kind of just glossed over it in this talk. But the point that I was trying to make is that there are, giant ooids or pysoids found in these sections. There are stromatolites, and there are just really abundant mist structures, stromatolites, microbialites found in all of these sections right across this transition. And yeah, trying to link that to potential environmental change was kind of the connection I was trying to make there. In terms of, differences in microbial structures or stromatolites found across this transect, sure. But I don't know. It'd be fun to sit down and talk with you about some of those trends. But yeah, there are all sorts of different microbial structures found across the basin. I don't know if I can say something smart about like trends that I see in one direction. But yeah, they're found kind of at different places stratigraphically and all of these sections. I don't know if that answered your question, but I'd be happy to chat more.
Yeah,
if I did.
It got to it. Yeah, I'd love to. I'm particularly interested in like the siliciclastic mats, so love to chat sometime about what you've observed. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah.
All right, next up, Daniel Segessenman, please go ahead.
Hey, Emmy, great talk. It was really cool to see those rocks and makes me want to go back out there and see those again. But I was curious, you've observed quite a few transgressive sequences in the White Inyos sections. I was curious if you have any ideas about what might have been driving those transgressive sequences and if those could be related to subsidence margin or margin subsidence, associated with rifting, if there was indeed rifting there at the time.
Yeah, I think as I alluded to, I think during the late Ediacaran and early Cambrian, I think there is evidence for active rifting, kind of the final stages of rifting before the development of a passive margin. And so my interpretation for many of these, transgressions and changes in relative sea level would be that they're driven by the last stages of active rifting and tectonism here.
Cool. And then, sorry, just one other thing, because really interesting with the dates coming from the, constraining drift thickness pedum. But would you have any other, so having looked at the Ediacaran Cambrian transition and thought about it, you've been looking at that a lot. Do you think there are any other potential indicators that we could use to mark the Ediacaran Cambrian transition if indeed drift thickness pedum is diacronous and tends to be kind of problematic?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't have a good answer for it. Yeah, should it be the first appearance of trilobites? Should it be the first appearance of Archaeocyathus? Should it be this negative carbon isotope excursion? I think what I've come down on is we need more ages. We need more radioisotopic high resolution ages from these sections to really test some of these hypotheses rigorously. And so how, where to actually place the boundary, I don't have strong opinions, but yeah, I would love to see more ages out of more of these sections. To really,
I was gonna say I agree, and thank you for contributing to those ages. All right.
Yeah,
That's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, next hand, Greg Vitalik.
Yeah, great talk, Emmy. I really enjoyed it. And your idea of mass extinction at the end of the Ediacaran is something I've been puzzling about myself. But I want to ask about something different. That wonderful slab that now Evans is working over, we've corresponded for quite some time. I think some of those fossils are pteridinium as well as Ernietta. Is he thinking along the same lines, or does he have even more diversity on that slab?
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he thinks some of them are pteridinium.
Yay!
Even more diversity within that slab, which is pretty cool.
Just two, right? Taxa?
Yeah, pteridinium and Ernietta, right.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing it.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Okay, Andre, go ahead.
Yeah, great talk, Emmy. So I have two questions. Maybe I ask them separately. I don't work in Death Valley, but I take students there. And my feeling was that, and I think you kind of hinted towards it, but sort of the low part is very discontinuous between different ridges and rift related. But once you get to the level of Johnny Oolites, it's everything like a pancake type of stratigraphy. So I would sort of place it where drift transition somewhere at Johnny Oolite, maybe below it. And it has Shurham excursion, so it's 570. So it's way older than rifting you suggest. So it's kind of maybe related to question that Francis asked. So what's your comments on it?
Yeah, I think, this is debated in the literature about where stratigraphically to place the rift to drift transition. And people have suggested at the base or within the Johnny Formation, as you're mentioning, the Sterling, the Wood Canyon, even higher. And for me, I think we need more ages so there aren't many ages within the Ediacaran succession in the Death Valley region, in the White Inyo region, and up and down the margin. And so really to construct more robust subsidence curves, I think it would help and to really pin this or address this question of when the rift to drift happened. I think it's going to remain controversial and speculative until we have better ages and we can really calibrate some of the unconformities that exist within the many unconformities that exist within this succession. But yeah, you're right. I think there are a number of surfaces throughout that succession, and where to exactly place it, I'm not going to go out on a limb in this forum on it. Maybe at GSA, if you're going, we can chat more.
Okay. And the second question, it's kind of minor, but it's kind of strike me. So when you talk about Ernietta and preservation, you mentioned paper, I think by Jones, that he argued that texturally, let's see if I got it, texturally mature, but compositionally immature sediments somehow helped to preserve it. So sort of thinking texturally mature and compositionally mature, in my mind, it's kind of required some cold climate condition where physical weathering would dominate. Do you have any evidence for cold climate at that time? I thought it's relatively warm.
That's right.
And second, can you maybe expand like what's the link between this sort of texturally mature and compositionally mature in terms of preservation of Orniata?
Yeah, so he looked at one of these Orniatomorphs preserved within the slab and found coarse quartz grains that were not found in the surrounding matrix. And so that's where that interpretation came from. I think this idea should be tested in fossils from the Nama assemblage and possibly elsewhere. But basically it's the grains that were found within the fossil, within the infill of the fossil, and those found in the surrounding matrix and some of those differences. And then he compared it to, I didn't show this, but there are a bunch of weird sedimentological features found within the Wood Canyon, and some of them have been suggested to be possible Orniatomorphs or poorly preserved Orniatomorphs. And so James Hall, in this study, he compared a really well-preserved Orniatomorph to one of these questionable or poorly preserved Orniatomorphs. To come up with this interpretation about, some of the infill and the composition of the infill being critical to preservation. So he put this idea forth based off of, a couple samples, and I think that idea remains to be tested elsewhere. As to your question about, climate, I would agree with you though that, we think this is a pretty warm time, not a cold time. Yeah, happy to chat more if that didn't answer your question.
Well, no, that's good.
Okay.
And maybe last question, when you showed a Lyle work, I think between 539 and you showed, I guess, with real thickness, right? Between 539 and 532 was quite a bit of thickness, and when much less thickness towards 550, 531. Does it imply different depositional rates or breaks? I'm just from my memory. Let's see.
Sorry, maybe I'm missing what you're saying. You're talking about this work?
No, it was probably before. A slide before, one or two. Yeah. So between 539 and 532, it's maybe twice less thick if you are showing real thickness here, compared to sort of distance between 532 and 531. Does it imply sort of truncated record or maybe different depositional rate or gaps between?
Yeah, it's a good question. I see what you're saying. So this age, I didn't talk about this. This comes from northern Mexico, from the Cerro Rajon section. This is work that was led by Blake Hodgen. And this is a maximum depositional age. And yeah, I think you're right that this does require some sort of hiatus here. And yes, there are multiple hiatuses within. It kind of depends on which section you're talking about. Are you talking about the Cerro Rajon section or the Death Valley stratigraphy or White Indios? But yeah, there are places where you can stick a little bit of missing time. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Lyle said it max depositional age. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to push back on that a little bit because it's a maximum depositional age. So based on the carbon isotope curve, I don't think it doesn't seem like there should be a hiatus there since we see this slow transition. So I think it's more to do with the fact that it's a MDA rather than depositional age.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Thanks, Emmy and Lyle.
All right. So we have 3 questions from Sandor. I'm going to go ahead and read them out one at a time. what was the ecological relationship like between taxons like Ernieatomorphs, Claudinids, and the microbial mats?
What was the ecological relationship? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer to that because we never find them on the same bedding surfaces within the same beds. So great question. I don't know.
I mean, maybe I can leave you to read the other two out loud and address them.
Yeah, and how did the stromatolites and thrombolites affect the spatial arrangement between the various bilateral and metazoan taxa? I think I don't know how they're affecting the arrangement between the bilaterian and metazoan taxa, but one thing I will say is, you know, one difference between this area and Namibia, as I briefly mentioned in my talk, is that, you know, in the Nama we see a lot of skeletal material in the thrombolites and the stromatolites, and that's something that we don't see. We've made multiple thin sections of the stromatolites and the thrombolites, and you know, there are a couple places maybe where you can see trapping and binding of some conical skeletal material, but in general, we don't see evidence for skeletal material associated or found within within the thrombolites and stromatolites. So that is, you know, some maybe a striking difference between these sections in the Great Basin and some other sections globally, other Nama equivalent, Nama aged late Ediacaran sections globally. And then the third question, does the general spatial arrangement of the taxa on mats change across the base? Yeah, so I think one point I'll make is that, you know, one thing again that's different from other localities is that we're not finding soft body preservation associated with the surfaces that have these microbially induced sedimentary structures. So we're not finding Ediacaran fossils on mats, as has been described from, you know, sites in Australia and in other places globally. As for the change across the base, yeah, as I mentioned, there does seem to be this biotic change coinciding with this carbon isotope excursion. So all of these Ediacaran body fossils are found below it, and then we see the appearance of Cambrian type trace fossils and body fossils above it. I hope that answers your question.
All right. With that, there doesn't appear to be anything else out there. There was some interesting discussion and some plugged GSA talks in there, which I'm not sure if those are to be interpreted as declarations of battle or not, but that's there. Thank you so much, Emmy. It was a really well formulated talk and really, really well delivered. It was great to see you and great to hear from you. So everybody take care, and we'll see you further along next week. I think we'll see quite a few people from the plate tectonic side. We have Terrace Jeria talking about some tectonic stuff, so modeling. All right, everyone, have a good one.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.